Hello, everyone. Hi, everybody. My name is Jorge Chapa. I'm head of market transformation. As part of market transformation, I'm specifically in charge of the Green Star rating system, our partnerships and products and services. I'm also very proud to have said to be part of the development of the carbon neutral standard for buildings, which we're talking to you about today. Before we start, very briefly want to give an overview of who the GBCA is. We actually noted that there were a fair number of people in the list that had not been current GBCA members, so we thought we'd take the opportunity to give you a brief overview of whom we are. We are a not-for-profit, an internationally recognized organization dedicated to the sustainable transformation of the built environment. We create market-based solutions that empower and incentivize industry to embrace sustainable practices, in addition to doing a significant amount of advocacy work at local, state, federal, and sometimes global level, and running education courses and webinars. We recently recasted our vision for our organization. Our vision is to create healthy, resilient, and positive places for people and the natural environment. And our new strategic plan clearly calls for additional emphasis being placed on carbon and climate change. And this is a good segue to say, why then are we involved with the carbon neutral standard, or why is carbon neutrality important for the built environment? In August of 2015, the Australian government announced its COP21 targets. We then went through to have the Paris Agreement signed in December of last year. It introduced language stating that 2 degrees was to be the global target, that we were going to try and hit a 2 degree above pre-industrial levels, with a view to change and increase the target to 1.5 degree above that. This very quickly set a trend line that Australia as a country needed to meet to achieve this goal. The building industry set out to figure out how they could help, what was the share of the carbon budget that they needed to deal with. And as such, the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, which is an organization of organizations in the built environment, released a report called Low Carbon High Performance. This report outlined what needed to happen if we were to hit the COP21 targets as the Australian government committed. It detailed that by 2050 the built environment needed to be carbon neutral. And industry leaders very quickly realized that this meant something important for their business. We're already seeing moves by rating agencies, banks, and others to look for assets that meet the more stringent trajectory, and Australia's built environment is incredibly reliant on foreign investment. The drive really to be seen as the best scoring country in the DJSI and GRESB is a response to this. So combined with all of the trajectories and aspects around carbon neutrality, the trajectories around carbon that we're seeing worldwide, Australian built environment is really seeing carbon neutrality as a de-risking strategy for the built environment. We strongly believe that this will drive developers, owners, and investors to start to look for, develop, own, operate assets that are carbon neutral or have the capacity to be. Really what we're trying to see, or what we're seeing now, is we'd like to move away from the random acts of carbon neutrality into adopting carbon neutrality at scale and as quickly as possible. It really isn't also just Australia that's grappling with how to achieve this. At COP21 last year, World Green Building Council and ourselves, South Africa and Canada, announced that we would be moving to deliver certifications that would identify and promote net zero buildings in their own country. We then were joined by 7 other green building councils. So not just domestically but internationally, net zero emissions for the built environment are a target outcome. And the first thing we need to do that is to have a clear, auditable, and trusted definition of what carbon neutrality is. That brings us to today. Thankfully, Australia already has a standard to define carbon neutrality. The standard covered organizations, events, and products. It made sense then to expand the standard to cover the built environment, specifically precincts and buildings. And so we established a partnership between ourselves, the Federal Department of Environment and Energy, and the New South Wales Office of Environment and Heritage, specifically the NABERS team, to work with the industry to develop a standard that we believe is a world first. That is to have a standard that is accepted by industry, voluntary rating systems, state departments, and the federal government that defines what carbon neutrality is for the built environment. This, we believe, will strongly align interests across all parties in the built environment to demand, occupy, and operate buildings to carbon neutrality. There's still much work to do to address the issues surrounding climate change, but this is a fundamental first step in delivering a carbon positive industry, and one that we're very excited to be part of. As such, I would really like to now introduce Melanie Kaepernick, who is our next speaker. Melanie Kaepernick is Director of the Carbon Neutral Team in the Australian Government Department of Environment and Energy. She has over 12 years experience in various areas of national climate change policy, including the Carbon Farming Initiative, the Asia-Pacific Partnership Renewable Energy Task Force, and a range of emission reduction policies and programs in the agriculture, local government, and community sectors. Melanie has an interest in driving innovation and building partnerships on climate action, and she holds a bachelor's and a PhD in molecular biology from the University of New South Wales. Melanie, if you can, please take it on from here. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Jorge. Just getting the technology sorted so everyone can see. I think they can already. Right, so thanks Jorge for that overview, and I think you've already introduced me enough there. I think I just wanted to just say, so we in the Carbon Neutral team, which is the team that I run, have I guess 3 broad areas that we look after. One being to maintain the national carbon offset standard and ensure its alignment with international standards and best practice. The second is that we certify carbon neutrality against that standard. And thirdly, we manage and look after the trademark. Now I'd like to take you through, in my presentation, a little bit more about the details of the standard that is for public consultation, given that Jorge has given a great overview of the context there. So in terms of what I'll focus on is firstly a bit of background on the existing standard, which already exists for organizations and products. Then giving a bit of an overview of carbon neutrality and offsetting more generally. Followed by the development of specifically the carbon neutral building standard, the requirements of that standard, and making a submission. So firstly, just for a bit of background, the carbon neutral certification, National Carbon Offset Standard, has been around since 2010. The scheme is made up of the standard, the certification program, namely the Carbon Neutral program, and the certification trademark that can be used by certified entities. All this is currently already available for organizations to become carbon neutral for their business operations and for products and services. A bit more on that is that the standard sets benchmarks for carbon accounting, reporting and auditing, and it provides a list of eligible offset units. The certification program certifies organizations, products and service against the requirements of the standard and sets the obligations for ongoing carbon neutral commitments to maintain that certification. The certification trademark can only be used by certified entities that have a license agreement with the department. And there are various variants available for that, of that trademark, depending on the category certified. Some of our, just to give you an overview of some of the existing members that are already that have already been certified as carbon neutral, they include a wide variety of organizations and businesses, including councils, airlines, property management, banks, SMEs, non-for-profits, wine, fish, oil, furniture, paper, and a few others. Now, carbon neutrality and offsetting. Just a bit of an overview, because this is, I guess, a bit of a new scene in the property sector, at least, in terms of this. What is carbon neutral? Carbon neutral refers to a situation where the emissions associated with an activity are equal to 0, because the emissions have been reduced and offset units cancelled to fully account for all the remaining emissions. So to become carbon neutral, organizations calculate their emissions, identify opportunities for emission savings, reduce emissions where possible, and then cancel offset units equivalent to any remaining emissions. The National Carbon Offset Standard provides structure around this process to ensure that carbon neutral claims have resulted in real emission reductions. So the standard sets benchmarks and requirements for carbon accounting, reporting and auditing. And those requirements are based on existing Australian and international standards, especially the series of greenhouse gas protocol standards and several ISO standards. Secondly, the standard provides guidance on genuine offset units, as well as a list of offset units eligible. But before I explain that, I thought it might be worth taking a short diversion into offsetting more generally. As this topic still receives some skepticism, I think it is worth pointing out to create some clarity. So firstly, offset projects. These are projects that conduct activities that either reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that would be released into the atmosphere under business as usual, or activities that sequester or pull down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into trees and vegetation. So examples include tree planting, reforestation, rainforest protection. Many of these projects provide benefits additional to carbon reductions. So an Australian example are the Savannah Fire Management projects. In these, Indigenous communities are changing the fire management regime to burn savanna early in the season, thereby avoiding the much hotter emission-intensive fires that would occur otherwise. So such a project has benefits also to community and employment. Similarly, there are projects in developing countries that, for example, are providing solar cook stoves to communities that might otherwise cut down trees for their cooking, or engage rural communities in replanting forests in their vicinity. There are many, many types of projects with various additional benefits and also various costs associated with the particular project. We've actually found that a lot of the existing carbon neutral certified organisations use the co-benefits of their offsets to tell a holistic story of their carbon neutral journey to their stakeholders. So how do the reductions from such a project get to be used to count as reductions elsewhere? For this, you need to think global. Emissions produced by one entity can be compensated for by the reductions of an offset project. And overall, that leads to zero emissions or carbon neutrality. Of course, we need to get better than that and reduce global emissions overall. However, in some cases, there are limitations to how much we can reduce from a particular process or right now. And as such, offset projects are useful in that they can compensate for the emissions that we currently cannot reduce any further. So they can help us today, right now, while we continue to work on ways to reduce emissions. And at the same time, it's worth remembering, as I mentioned, that offset purchases support other benefits to the environment and people. And some of these even align with the Sustainability Development Goals. So what is really important is that the emission reductions made by the offset project are in fact real and measured reductions. So it needs to be clear that one offset unit for sale truly represents 1 tonne of CO2 emissions reduced. And that is why in the National Carbon Offset Standard we are very clear on what type of offset units are allowed to be used in transactions for making a carbon neutral claim. So the standard provides rules on the types of offset units that can be used. The offset units eligible for a carbon neutral claim under the standard must meet all the integrity criteria set by the standard. The criteria are designed to ensure genuine emission reductions are achieved when using the offset units. The criteria include checks for additionality, permanence, measurability, transparency, independent auditing, and that they are registered on a public registry. And there's a list of eligible offset units available in the standard. So that was a bit of background on offsetting and carbon neutrality, which I think might have been worth giving, just so that yeah, that we're all on the same page. Now, in terms of developing the carbon neutral building standard, as Jorge mentioned already, it was pretty much March 2016 when we launched into starting development of this, when Minister Hunt announced that the existing National Carbon Offset Standard would be expanded to include buildings and precincts. And I guess the aim, pretty much straight away, it could be quite clearly stated, is that the aim of such a standard would be to provide a carbon neutral building standard and certification process that is both easy to use and credible. And it should provide buildings with new opportunities. They should benefit from new opportunities, potentially through the use of the trademark to showcase achievement. And buildings should know that their carbon neutrality has met a credible standard that can stand up to scrutiny, which protects the reputation of the building sector as a whole. The approach taken thus far in developing the draft standard has been primarily twofold. One is that it would be an expansion of the existing NCOS, or National Carbon Offset Standard, to ensure so that they maintain the integrity already established through existing requirements. And secondly, to streamline the certification process to align with existing building and energy efficiency rating systems. And that is to ensure ease of use and resource efficiency for everyone. Getting the balance right between credibility and usability has been at the forefront of our mind with everything we've done so far. Alignment with international standards and best practice as relating to carbon accounting and offsetting is important to ensure ongoing credibility of the standard. Streamlining with existing processes valued by the industry is important for cost, usability and implementation. Our consultations so far, I'll skip through this because I think Jorge has mentioned them. We very quickly built collaborations that greatly assisted the development so far with GBCA and NABERS. An expert technical committee was established in April, and meetings with this group were held from April to August. They were focused on analysing the existing standard for organisations and determining how the requirements would fit with buildings. Drafting of the standard and several ad hoc meetings followed with potential future users and brought us to November, which, as you know, the draft standard is now open for public consultation. The public consultation of the standard, there's just a few things to make you aware of to set the scene. Firstly, it's a voluntary standard. It is for buildings in operation or building operations. It does not include embedded emissions at this time. Recognition that that is important, but it is not this particular standard at this point in time. For the standard is for either base or whole building operations, and the certification would be provided through either the Australian Government's Carbon Neutral Program, the NABERS Energy, or the Green Star Performance Systems. Now, a bit more on the requirements of the standard. So again, to aim for integrity and usability, the standard requirements are largely based on the existing NCOS, so to align with international best practice and so forth. The certification pathway should be streamlined with existing schemes, as mentioned earlier. Oh, sorry, I'm going one back. And just to mention, in terms of the certification trademark, there will be variants available that would say something like base building or whole building as part of that trademark. Yet to be developed, but something along those lines. So how to become carbon neutral against the standard? This follows the logical progression that we already discussed earlier, from measuring and accounting for existing emissions, reducing those emissions as much as possible, and offsetting the remaining emissions through the purchase and cancellation of offset units to reach zero emissions. The standard requires you to do this on an annual basis, and sets rules on how to do each step. I'll talk a bit more on the 5 main requirements under these steps, but in doing so, I will focus on what is required to meet under the standard rather than the process for achieving certification against this. And that's because the process will be different depending on which certification pathway is used, that is NABERS, Green Star or Carbon Neutral program. And I do believe Dennis from NABERS and Jorge from GBCA can explain a little bit more on how the requirements can be met in a streamlined way through those existing programs. So I will focus here on the actual requirements. So in terms of the measurement, credible carbon accounting techniques are a requirement of the standard. To know your emissions, you must prepare a carbon account. Requirements of the standard are based on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and other international carbon accounting standards. The steps to preparing a carbon account are basically, firstly, that you need to establish an emissions boundary, identify the emission sources within that boundary, collect data on emission sources, and then calculate the total carbon account multiplying your data with published emissions factors. Now a bit more on the emission sources, because as you might note, the standard requires that scope 1, 2 and 3 are needed to be reported. So a bit more on that. So emissions sources are categorized into scope 1, 2 and 3. Scope 1 are direct emissions from sources that you control, like fuel use. Scope 2 is energy indirect, so that's purchased electricity, heat and steam, any kind of electricity you purchase for the building. Scope 3 are other indirect emissions that occur because of your activities, such things as waste, business travels, purchased goods and services. Scope 3 can be very broad depending on the for the standard, especially if you're looking at if in the past we're talking about organizations being certified. For buildings, there's been the draft then has been set up to make waste, water and wastewater, WWW as I like to call them, are all considered to be relevant, and they must be included regardless of materiality. Transport must also be included once calculation methods have been established. So there's some recognition that transport is difficult to measure at this point, and therefore we can think about how to do this into the future, but that it is relevant has been put into the standard. Now, reductions. A requirement of the standard is to reduce before offsetting. So reductions should follow the hierarchy of energy efficiency, on-site renewables, and off-site renewables. And very importantly, you must maintain and report an emission reduction strategy or meet requirements of 4-star NABERS energy rating or 4-star Green Star performance ratings if going via the NABERS and Green Star pathway. And just a little aside, a further point on reductions. Besides it being the right thing to do, reducing internally first, when undertaking emission reductions as part of a carbon neutral claim, the reductions lead to cost savings on 2 fronts. One, the dollar savings that usually result from improved efficiencies, but secondly also the dollar savings from having to purchase less offset units to get to zero emissions. So in this way, a carbon neutral commitment can actually provide a business case and driver for ongoing emission reduction activities. And we have actually found that from some of our certified organizations who have given us that kind of feedback. Now, let's offsets. Genuine offset units have to have been purchased and cancelled for any remaining emissions. So this is where it is the eligibility list that is available in the standard is is the list which explains which offset units you can use for making a claim of carbon neutrality. And also important is that at the time of the carbon neutral claim, the units must be cancelled or retired on a public registry. So that is this way they cannot be used again by someone else. They're actually gone. They've been cancelled. The units that are currently eligible under the standard, we've listed them there, but they're the Australian carbon credit units and then various international units issued by various standards. Further details is actually in the appendix. Transparent reporting and auditing is also a requirement of the standard. The integrity of a carbon neutral claim largely relies on the transparency of measures taken to support the claim. So the standard requires that all steps taken are reported annually so that the claim can be objectively assessed by stakeholders or the public. The annual public report must include total greenhouse gas emissions of the building, disclosure of emission sources excluded, summary of emission reduction activities undertaken, and details of quantity and type of offset units retired. And that annual report must be made publicly available, for example, via a website, and it will also be posted on the department's website. And independent auditing of all parts of the claim is required at minimum every 2 years. Now, as my notes have said at the bottom of several of these slides, some of these requirements will automatically be met via the NABERS energy or Green Star performance processes tweaked. But I won't go into those. That's more for the others. But just noting that these, again, I'm talking about the requirements of the standard. The process of how you achieve them will come later. Now, making a submission. To make a submission, you will need to review the draft document, which I'm sure all of you have read already. A few points here. There are some sections that are not open for review, but have been included for completeness. So just taking you through that briefly. For example, so section 1, overview and key principles, that section contains the key principles and international best practice on which the requirements of the National Carbon Offset Standard are based. That includes the integrity criteria for the offsets and carbon accounting principles. Those high-level principles are not open for review. Section 2 and 3, which are the requirements of the standard and certification, that's up for review. Appendix A is the eligible offset list. That is also not for review at this time. We do review that regularly, but not for the purpose of this. And Appendix B, carbon accounting requirements and guidance, that is for review. But do note that this appendix is not only for buildings. It's actually designed to be relevant to all carbon neutral categories. So organisations, products, services, precincts, all use this appendix as additional guidance and accounting requirements. So you'll need to keep that in mind as you read that it's not just for buildings. How to make a submission? Well, we have a submission template that we would ask you to use. You can find it at that link there and send it to our carbon neutral inbox. The submissions close on the 10th of February and we're looking forward to all your input, and if you have some ideas and suggestions, it's great if you give us the solutions that you recommend as well, rather than just issues. That's always much appreciated and helps us actually come to an endpoint more quickly. And some further information, you can always go onto our website or contact us directly. I'm always happy to have a chat. And I think that concludes my webinar, and I will hand back over. I hope it was useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melanie. And now I would like to introduce Dennis Lee from the New South Wales Office of Environment and Heritage. Dennis is a NABERS technical manager. Whoops, just realized Sorry, Dennis is a Neighbours technical manager. He has been managing the technical team for over 3 years and has in-depth understanding of rating tools in the property sector. Dennis is an engineer with over 10 years experience working in sustainability across a variety of industries. And we thank him for coming here. He will be talking to us about Neighbours Energy and the carbon neutral standard. Dennis?
Hello and happy Friday. Today I'll be going through the Neighbours pathway for applying for the carbon neutral standard. In this I don't have any slides, so you'll have to pay attention to me, which is a bit mean for a Friday I think, but anyway. What I'll be going through is the Neighbours certification pathway and how the Neighbours will work together with the carbon neutral standard and how we meet the requirements within. So the first obvious advantage of the Neighbours pathway, for those who are already doing Neighbours ratings, it'll be the one application for also applying for carbon neutral standard, which will make the administration of it a little bit easier from the applicant's side. I'm now going to start going into some detail around the requirements of the standard, Chapter 2, where we specifically meet some of the requirements and where our current ratings differ. So for those who are familiar with Neighbours ratings, some of this will make sense. For those who are not so familiar with Neighbours rating, you just have to bear with me. So I'm looking at steps 1 and 2, where we're talking about emissions boundaries and the emission sources. So the establishment of the emissions boundary, the Neighbours rating, the whole building and the base building rating do comply with that standard, and that's the emission boundary that you will use for the carbon neutral certification. Some of the additional items that you will need to include in your emissions boundary, because the Neighbours rating covers most of your Scope 1 and most of your Scope 2 emissions, are refrigerants for your Scope 1. In addition, if your site is generating and selling any of large generation certificates, that is LGCs, then they will need to be counted back into your carbon account after the Neighbours rating. And finally, the Scope 3. In the Neighbours rating, we do track some Scope 3 emissions, but they're in reference solely to transmission and distribution losses of the electricity network. So where you see Scopes 1, 2 and 3, it's just for the Scopes 1, 2 and 3 of electricity. So you will need to include the minimum requirements, as Melanie has mentioned earlier, water, wastewater, waste and transport to come in the future when we have a solid methodology to move forward with. Under the Neighbours emissions boundary, you will also be able to certify base building or whole building. So with the base building, that is a stepping stone towards moving the industry into a whole building carbon neutrality. Going on to step 3, which is your base year, the very first Neighbours rating that you do, that you apply for carbon neutrality with, that will become your base year, so you don't need to worry about any of the other base year requirements. Moving on to step 4, collecting data. That again, the Neighbours protocols already have a very solid and robust method of data collection, and the requirements for collecting that data, that also complies with the carbon neutral standards, so that is not a problem there either. Finally, moving on to step 5, the carbon account itself. So the Neighbours outputs from the boundary, including the additional Scope 1 refrigerants, the Scope 2 recounting of any large generator certificates or LGCs that the site has on sold, and the Scope 3. We'll provide you with your carbon account that's outstanding that you will need to offset in order to meet the carbon neutrality requirements. Once that carbon account is totaled, you can use any of the carbon offsets, as Melanie mentioned. For that, even though within the Neighbours rating itself, the Neighbours rating only recognises Scope green power to offset Scope 2 emissions. Once the final carbon account has been calculated, you can then use any offset for the remaining carbon. For the public reporting part, the Neighbours report does, we will be producing a report that will contain the additional information required that will satisfy the requirements of the public report. So this will be provided as part of your Neighbours outputs, and that will be in addition to your current certificate and your current Neighbours report. And finally, Neighbours will manage any of the auditing requirements that are required under the standard, under the independent audit section. So you don't need to worry about any further independent audits in that method. That wraps up the differences and the helping hand that Neighbours that certification pathway does offer, and I'll pass back to Jorge to go through the Green Star.
Thank you, Dennis. So once again, I'm back to briefly talk to you about how Green Star Performance and the standard work together to deliver carbon neutral buildings. In most cases, what Dennis said applies equally to Green Star Performance. We thought we'd take the opportunity to delve a bit more deeply into it. For those of you who are not familiar what Green Star Performance is, it is a rating tool released in 2014 for buildings in operation. It is targeted at both single buildings and existing building portfolios and provides guidance to building owners and existing facility management teams on how to deliver sustainable buildings through management practices and actual building performance. Green Star Performance is relevant to all building types. When it comes to offices for greenhouse gas emissions and from building operations, Green Star Performance links up very nicely with Neighbours Energy. For all other sectors, Green Star Performance provides mechanisms for measuring greenhouse gas emissions and comparing them against a benchmark. To date, we have certified more than 400 buildings from the Sydney Opera House to industrial facilities in Western Australia. It is therefore a great method for certifying all building classes and for their operational performance. As you can see, Green Star Performance has many indicators or credits from management practices to transport materials and land use and ecology, including indoor environment quality. But critical to achieving carbon neutrality under the standard is that Green Star Performance allows you to submit information that is covered by Scope 1 and 2 emissions as well as Scope 3. So greenhouse gas emissions and the impacts from refrigeration credit addresses the Scope 1, 2 and emission sources covered by the standard, while the potable water credit and the 2 waste credits cover the Scope 3 emission sources. As Melanie mentioned, there is a minimum energy efficiency requirement expectation. In Green Star Performance, this is translated to at least a 4-star Green Star Performance rating, or for those buildings who cannot go for a full holistic rating at this time, at least 8 points for base building and 9 points for base building in greenhouse gas emissions. The points thresholds that we've set are roughly equivalent to what is found, roughly equivalent to the 4-star Neighbours Energy requirement. Throughout the standard, as you're going through, you will have seen that there's a number of guidance boxes that clearly outline what needs to be, how Green Star Performance or Neighbours Energy meet the requirements set out in that section. Specifically to the minimum energy efficiency requirement, we wanted to highlight that there is a small leeway allowed of 3 years for buildings who are coming in for the first time to Neighbours Energy or Green Star Performance and trying to seek a carbon neutral certification. This allows them to build up to the minimum efficiency requirement, but it is a commitment and it's only a 3-year gate or a three-year allowance. Once the 3-year allowance is not met, then this building cannot actually achieve carbon neutrality through these 2 pathways. Throughout the standard, you'll see different bits of guidance that clearly outline what is compliant or what is not compliant from Neighbours Energy and Green Star Performance, and it is worthwhile highlighting and making sure that you read through those as you're going through the standard. But in a nutshell, for Green Star Performance, we will try and take care of most of the requirements in the carbon neutral standards to make sure that you're able to comply with it if you want to get a label, the certification alongside the Green Star Performance rating. So you will register through the Green Star online portal. You will then sign a carbon neutral licensing agreement in addition to the Green Star Performance agreement. You will submit the documentation. Our submission templates will be modified to collect information relevant to the standard. That'll all be taken into account. The documentation will be assessed and the assessors will assess in accordance with the standard to make sure that the auditing happens at the same time as Dennis mentioned. And finally, you will receive your certificate. That certificate will be modified to serve as a public report for the standard, fulfilling the standard requirements. One thing we've mentioned a lot is that this is for existing buildings, and that is true. That's what the standard has been built for, but we did want to highlight for those of you who are putting in any commentary for the new construction rating tools consultation process which is currently out. We are looking at developing an innovation challenge to get people to commit to carbon neutral buildings at that stage, so we encourage you to take a look at it if possible. That's it for me in terms of how Green Star Performance helps you meet your requirement for the carbon neutral standard. But at this point, I'd like to ask if there's any questions for our speakers, and I just happen to be next to the question log, and there are a lot. So we will try and get through most of them. I will say that now, but if we can't, we will make sure that you get an answer back offline. So Melanie and Dennis, if you can just, I'll direct some of those questions to yourselves. And the first one is comes from Victoria. Is the question related to whether what happens to organizations that want to get a tenancy carbon neutral label, and does this standard cover them? I'm happy to take that, unless you, Melanie, want to go for it.
Sounds like you've got an answer in your head already.
I do.
Go for it.
Perfect. Essentially, when we looked at this standard, we very clearly set a boundary for buildings and precincts. So we haven't spoken about the precinct scale, but it's mostly very similar. The expectation was that for most organizations, if they want to get a carbon neutral tenancy, they should be looking at their whole of carbon neutrality. They shouldn't necessarily just be looking at their fit out. So at this stage, that is the answer that I would be giving people. If a tenancy, if an organization wants to be carbon neutral, the tenancy is included in that carbon account, and that would then help the building owner be able to get a whole building rating, but it should not just be in isolation.
Should I just, Jorge, just to add to that point, maybe just to point out that like a scenario that if you do have, if there is a building that has a tenant that is already certified as carbon neutral under the standard as an organization, so when I call them a tenant, I mean like the organization is certified, then that organization would be already reporting and offsetting their emissions of that space, and so that building can then, you know, either the building or the tenant needs to come to an agreement then who's actually offsetting that part of the emissions, because obviously you don't need to do it twice. So the building could then say, well, that tenancy is equal to zero emissions because it's already been offset through the organisational pathway, or vice versa. So there's an opportunity there to work together with carbon neutral certified organisations as well.
Thank you, Melanie. A question which I think, Dennis, you might be well placed to actually answer, which is, with regards to setting the emission boundary, is there any alignment with NGERS, or is it necessary to have two sets of accounts? How does that work?
There is some alignment with NGERS. The core of the carbon neutral standard is aligned with the principles of NGERS in terms of operational control, and that does flow through to the neighbours emissions boundary as well, particularly in the base building side of things, where the boundary really is around who has operational control of that asset. So for the base building, we're looking at, from the building owner's perspective, core services such as lifts, air conditioning services, car park ventilation, etc. So it does follow that similar boundary.
Melanie, do you have any thoughts on that you'd like to add, or?
No, I think that's fine. Yep.
Perfect. Next question, which is for Scope 3 emissions, are goods and services included, or are they? Is it just limited to what's in the standard?
So it depends. It depends on the of the relevance. So there's a test of relevance and materiality that pretty much applies to most of the Scope 3. So if it's a good or service that would be considered relevant to the building operations, and you guys can help me out there what that could be, then you would need to include it if it's material. So I mean, we're talking very hypothetical there, so we might have to come up with an example. But yes, goods and services generally are, and it just depends on the relevance. And with relevance, you need to consider also in terms of, you know, stakeholder expectations of relevance and so forth. So I don't know if you've got some examples there of a goods and service. We could use that.
I think that's particularly valuable for the organizational events and products, definitely, where you do go around looking for this. One of the issues that I think it would be very valuable for industry to talk to us about is the aspect of Scope 3 emissions. So we've clearly highlighted that water and waste are the key elements that we're looking for in all accounts, no matter what. We think that's relevant and material to most buildings, with transport being that extra space of it should probably be included, except we cannot have certainty on the data. So right now it's highlighted as an issue for development in the future. In terms of goods and services, for buildings, that's probably where the line very likely is drawn for 90% of all buildings, I would say, 95% of all buildings. The expectation, at least in the standard, the way that sets it out, isn't the way that it's written right now doesn't necessarily set out that additional tests need to happen for most cases. There's a sensitivity check that happens, but it's not necessarily fully in-depth. For instance, for something, when it's always hard to think about what that would be, but for the edge cases. But for a typical office building or retail center, or most building types, the standard is limiting the Scope 3 aspects to what has been defined.
Great.
But it is important for those of you who might be looking at getting at a corporate organizational level to really consider Scope 3 emissions separately. One question, another question that's come up here is related to the fact as to when will embodied energy be included, or for carbon neutral for buildings in operation. I'm happy to start this answer, but it's actually been something that we have discussed a fair bit, and was discussed a fair bit during the consultation or the initial development period of the standard. To that we would say that we are looking at whether embodied energy will need to be picked up in the future for new developments. At this point, that's not the intent for existing buildings in operation. So there is a further stage of development for new developments that we're looking at.
Yep, I agree.
Great. Let me just quickly scroll, and noting that we have a few minutes. We have a question here as to whether Green Star certified assessors or neighbors assessors are going to be doing the auditing for the carbon neutral certification, or whether it will be external certification. Dennis, would you like to answer that one?
We're still working out the details at the moment. I think it will be a mix of both our neighbours assessors and the Green Star assessors who will be doing a lot of that work. We'd like to get them to do as much of it as possible to minimise the administration on going that extra step and becoming carbon neutral. Obviously, where there are gaps in what they are able to do and complying with standards, there might be some element of an additional audit or independent person coming in.
And for example, in the case of Green Star Performance, where we do manage to go through most of the issues that would be relevant to this, it is very likely that for most building types, the assessment process itself serves as the independent audit. You wouldn't necessarily have to get one of the big four companies to do a separate audit of your carbon account. If you follow those protocols. If there's something that you then decide to bring in, say for waste, for whatever reason you did not submit that as per the requirements of the protocol, of the Green Star Performance Submission Guidelines, then at that point that's a separate conversation that needs to happen. But if you're following the pathways in Neighbours Energy, the bits that Neighbours Energy checks and the things that Green Star Performance checks, you're not required to have that separately validated by an external person. Or at least that's the current proposal. If Melanie, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, I think I think you've highlighted, or you've both highlighted I guess the aim being that applicants coming through Neighbours and Green Star don't have to do an additional step by themselves. If I'm correct, that's what the aim is from your perspective. From the standards perspective, we obviously need to assure that the independency of the auditing requirements are maintained, and what we are now in the next few months working with Neighbours and Green Star to work out how the systems can meet those requirements, and what we need to make sure that there's still independence and meeting of the requirements of the standard. But that's going to happen sort of as part of the development from here onwards, and I don't think the outcome will be any different to the actual applicant that will then come through the Green Star and Neighbours. Is that how you see that, Jorge? And then
I think, yeah, I think the simplification piece is the key thing that we've tried to work on as much as possible to try and get the industry to use existing processes to achieve certification quickly and cheaply, or as best as we can. And I think that's a critical component, or the key message that we want to get out. And that's one of the things that we do ask people to tell us as part of the consultation, which is that's our intent. We're being open about the fact that this is our intent. If when reading the standard that intent is not matching, the standard is not matching our intent, that is an important discrepancy we need to be made aware of so we can actually make the relevant amendments.
Yeah, I just actually, can I just, because you've made at this point, it's probably quite important to note, the standard that you have, the draft standard that's out, is very much also aligned with all the other standards for organizations, products, precincts and so forth. So some of those requirements, they're going to be very similar across all of the standards. So it's, you know, it'll be something we need to work out across everything, and we have to work out the processes of how to meet the standards rather than so much the changing the requirements. So just for readers of the standards, so they're aware of that.
Yep, I agree, and I think that's one of the better things about how the standard has been outlined, that there are matching requirements and that it looks and feels like it's a standard, and it's the certification pathways where we're able to then look at how we can assist industry. I think that was a great, for what it's worth. And I'm speaking as someone who was involved, but I thought the work that the department did in particular is actually worthwhile highlighting. We probably have, we're probably out of time now for questions, seeing as it's 12:25. So we probably won't have, I'm looking to see if we have a fairly simple short question that we can actually look at. The other, because we did get a fair number actually, a surprising number. What would be, I guess, something, Melanie, I don't know if you have a closing message. One of the questions, sorry, I'm looking through, is if a tenant, how does it work if you're an organization then that is carbon neutral? Can anyone that calls themselves carbon neutral, can you use that to maximize the, to say, put it in terms of the, let's say I'm an organization, I do my carbon account, I think I'm carbon neutral, I'm a tenant, and therefore I can give that to the building owner and say I'm carbon neutral. Does that work, or does it only for organizations or services or electricity that is formally certified where that counts?
Yeah, no, yeah. So yeah, it's an important distinction to make, is that to call yourself carbon neutral certified, it needs to be against the National Carbon Offset Standard, so through one of the standards, either being a product organisation or, in this case now, I guess, buildings and precincts as well. And it's only in that way, if you've got various certified organisations, buildings and so forth, that they can work together to reduce each other's, I guess, carbon account. But the key point there is they need to be certified. They can't just use the standard and then say that's it. In order for a carbon account to actually be reduced, they need to be certified and have gone through the processes of NABERS, GBCA, or us checking that carbon account.
Excellent, thank you. And just one final question, not just to make sure as we're finishing the webinar that people are aware of this, the closing date for receiving feedback by the department?
Yeah, so the closing date is the 10th of February. And as mentioned before, there's a submission form as well, and yeah, we're looking forward to receiving your responses on that. And do check out the precinct precinct draft standard, which is also out for consultation at the same time.
Excellent, thank you, Melanie. Any last comments?
I'm really excited and looking forward to the standard. I think it's a great move forward in line with the direction that the Australian government's taking, and we're really proud to have been a part of it in the development of the standard.
Thank you very much, Dennis, and thank you, Melanie, as well for giving us a good overview of the standard. At this point, I'd like to just briefly remind people that Green Cities tickets are on sale, and that I've been told that this is the last day for early bird. If you want to know more about what Australia's carbon trajectory for the built environment and what we all need to be doing around getting to that 1.5 degree or 2 degree trajectory as quickly as we can. Green Cities will have an exciting set of conversations around that topic, and we very, very strongly encourage you to attend. We'd also like to tell those of you who have not signed up that Greens on the Green is happening in Victoria, New South Wales in the month of February. It's a new year, new start. Let's all get together and have a bit of a party. Strongly encourage you to sign up if you can. And from all of us at GBCA, this is the last webinar of the year. We've run a very exciting program, and we don't say this often, so we'd like to say it publicly. We'd really like to thank our professional development team. They do a lot of work at making sure that this happens, and I truly hope you've enjoyed it. From all of us at here at GBCA, thank you for attending, and we'll see you next year.